Your alarm goes off. You already feel tired before your feet touch the floor. You open your phone. Notifications. An inbox that filled itself while you slept. A calendar already crowding tomorrow before today has even started. Somewhere between the coffee and the commute, you ask yourself a question you've asked 1,000 times before. Is this what a day is supposed to feel like? You assume this is simply what life demands. Wake, work, eat, work, sleep, repeat. But the real answer is far stranger. For almost the entire history of your species, none of this existed. No alarm, no manager, no 40-hour week, no shared idea that a day should be split into work and not work at all. The job, the single structure your whole life seems to orbit, is one of the newest inventions your brain has ever had to deal with. So what did people actually do with their time before jobs existed? Not for a strange, isolated tribe somewhere. For almost everyone, for almost all of human history. The honest answer is that they rested more than you'd expect. They talked, they wandered, they made things with their hands, they watched the sky, and they worked, yes, but nowhere near as much as you do now. That claim sounds impossible. Surely survival without supermarkets, without refrigeration, without medicine, took every waking hour just to stay alive. That was the assumption anthropologists carried for decades too. Then the fieldwork told a different story. In the 1960s, the anthropologist Richard Borshay Lee spent months living among the Juhoansi Sand people of the Kalahari Desert, one of the last groups on Earth still living a largely traditional foraging life. He expected to document a population on the edge of starvation, spending nearly every hour of daylight searching for food. Instead, he found something startling. Adults spent roughly 15 to 20 hours a week acquiring food. The rest of their time went to resting, socializing, storytelling, and craft work. 15 to 20 hours. Compare that to your own week. Around the same time, the anthropologist Marshall Sahlins gathered data like this from foraging societies across the globe and arrived at a phrase that quietly overturned a century of assumptions. He called them the original affluent society. Not affluent in the sense of owning things, affluent in the sense of having enough and having time. Sahlins argued that scarcity itself, the constant sense of not having enough, wasn't the natural condition of early humans. It was something that arrived later, alongside agriculture, property, and eventually, jobs. Pause on that for a moment. Your brain was not built inside a world of chronic scarcity. It was built inside a world where enough was, most days, actually enough. So what filled the rest of the day? Picture a small band, maybe 20 to 50 people, moving through a landscape they knew intimately. Morning might mean a short foraging trip, gathering roots, nuts, or fruit, tracking an animal, checking a trap. Afternoon might mean nothing scheduled at all. Sitting, talking, teaching a child to nap a stone tool or weave a net, resting in shade during the hottest hours. Grooming, in the literal sense, picking through each other's hair, which among primates isn't idle behavior. It's social glue. It's how trust gets built between individuals who need each other to survive. Evenings often meant fire, food, and story. Not entertainment in your modern sense. Something closer to cultural software, updated nightly. The anthropologist Polly Wiesner, studying the Juhomansi decades after Lee's original fieldwork, found that nighttime conversation around the fire was dominated by stories, not daytime economic complaints about food or resources. Daytime talk was practical. Nighttime talk was about relationships, myths, distant kin, and shared meaning. Firelight, it turns out, was one of the first stages your species ever built, and one of the first classrooms. None of this was leisure in the way you use the word today, a reward earned after labor. It was simply how a day was structured, because there was no separate category called work waiting to swallow the rest of it. Notice something else about that rhythm. There was no separation between the people you worked with and the people you loved. The person foraging beside you in the morning was the same person telling stories beside you at night. Work and relationship were the same activity, viewed from different angles. Your modern life split those two things apart. You commute away from the people who matter most in order to spend your best hours with people who are, most days, strangers wearing the same lanyard. That separation, work over here, love over there, is itself a historically recent arrangement, not a law of nature. There was risk in the old rhythm too. This wasn't paradise. A bad season could mean real hunger, a predator, an injury, an illness with no antibiotics. These were constant possibilities. But the risk was communal, spread across a band that shared what it found, because sharing was the actual insurance policy. If you came home empty-handed, someone else's catch fed you that night, and the debt was understood, not written down. simply carried forward until your turn came to provide. Anthropologists call this generalized reciprocity, and it functioned as something close to an ancient safety net, built from trust rather than contracts. Here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. This wasn't a primitive, temporary phase your ancestors were rushing to escape. For roughly 200,000 years, this rhythm, foraging, resting, socializing, storytelling, was the default human experience. Homo sapiens spent the overwhelming majority of its existence inside this pattern. The 8-hour office day you treat as eternal, unquestionable, practically written into human nature, has existed for a sliver of time so small it barely registers on the same timeline. So if humans had this much unstructured time, this much rest, why does modern life feel like the opposite? Why does your body treat busyness as normal and stillness as almost uncomfortable? The shift began roughly 12,000 years ago with agriculture. Farming looks on the surface like progress, predictable food, permanent settlements, surplus you could store for winter. But surplus changes everything about a society, and not always for the better. Once food could be stored, it could also be owned, guarded, taxed, and unevenly distributed. Once land was farmed, it needed defending. Once grain could be stockpiled, someone needed to control the stockpile. Anthropological and archaeological evidence increasingly suggests that early farmers in many regions worked longer hours and were often less healthy than the foragers who came before them. Skeletal evidence shows shorter stature, more dental disease, more signs of chronic labor strain. The trade was real. Stability in exchange for a body that worked harder and rested less. This is where something else was born, alongside the surplus: status. If one household's granary was fuller than another's, a hierarchy could form that never existed, or barely existed, among foraging bands. Wealth differences created power differences. Power differences created rulers, and rulers created demands. Suddenly there were people whose entire relationship to their own time was no longer their own to decide. Still, even then, there was no job in the modern sense. A farmer's year had rhythm, planting, tending, harvest, followed by long stretches of winter with far less to do. Seasonal, cyclical, tied to the land, not to a clock. The clock is where the real transformation happens. The anthropologist James Sussman, who has spent decades studying both the Juhohansi and the deep history of labor, traces the modern idea of a job to something surprisingly recent and surprisingly mechanical: industrialization. Factories needed something farms never had: synchronized human effort. A field doesn't care what hour you arrive to weed it. A factory line does. For the first time in human history, large numbers of people needed to show up at the exact same time, perform continuous, repetitive tasks for a fixed number of hours, and do this every single day, regardless of season, weather, or how their body actually felt that morning. This is the moment your brain, still running on foraging-era software, got handed an operating system it was never designed to run. A body built for bursts of effort, followed by rest, tuned by millions of years to work in rhythm with daylight, hunger, and season, was suddenly expected to perform at a constant, unchanging pace, indoors, on someone else's schedule, for decades. Is it any wonder burnout exists? Is it any wonder rest so often comes wrapped in guilt? Factories also introduced something foraging life never had: a stranger deciding the value of your time. In a band, the people you provided for were the same people who provided for you, face to face, known, trusted. Under industrial labor, the person setting your hours and your wage was often someone you'd never meet, judging your worth through output alone. Your ancient brain, built to read trust through faces, tone, and shared history, was suddenly asked to trust a wage slip instead. That gap between how your brain evaluates fairness and how a paycheck delivers it is still a source of quiet, constant friction today. Every time a raise feels arbitrary, or a bonus feels like it says something about your value as a person, rather than simply your output that quarter. There's a psychological price to all of this that researchers have only recently started measuring directly. The Harvard researcher Ashley Willens has spent years studying what she calls time affluence, the subjective feeling of having enough time versus feeling perpetually behind. Her research finds that chronic time scarcity, that low-grade hum of never having enough hours, correlates with lower well-being and higher stress, independent of income. People who feel time poor report worse life satisfaction than people who simply have less money but more unstructured time. Your ancestors, without knowing it, may have been wealthier in exactly the currency your modern life has quietly run out of. Here's the counterintuitive twist your brain doesn't expect. You likely assume that as humanity got richer, more advanced, more technologically capable, life would naturally include more free time, not less. Machines were supposed to do the hard work, and yet study after study on modern working hours shows something closer to stagnation, or even reversal in certain sectors, rather than the leisure society economists once predicted. The economist John Maynard Keynes famously guessed, in the 1930s, that by now people might be working around 15 hours a week, freed by technology to spend the rest of their time however they liked. That prediction did not come true. Not because the technology failed, because the structure built around work, the identity, the status, the sense of worth tied to productivity, expanded to fill the time machines were supposed to free up. This is where the ancient story quietly slides into your own life today. Your brain still measures your worth partly through contribution, through being useful to the group. Because for 200,000 years, contribution was survival. In a small foraging band, a person who didn't participate risked real social and physical consequences. That instinct never disappeared. It simply got redirected from hunting and gathering toward job titles, salaries, and performance reviews. When you feel guilty for resting, when a Sunday afternoon with nothing scheduled makes you uneasy instead of peaceful, you're not malfunctioning. You're running an ancient program, tuned for a world where usefulness meant belonging, inside a modern system that has stretched the definition of usefulness into something almost impossible to satisfy. And when a job ends, through layoff, retirement, or burnout, the identity crisis that often follows isn't only financial. It echoes something older. In a foraging band, your role, your contribution, your place among others, was your security. Losing that role wasn't just an economic problem. It touched the same nerve as social exile once did. This same instinct quietly shapes how you spend, not just how you work. Status among foragers was usually kept deliberately modest. Anthropologists studying egalitarian bands describe a practice sometimes called insulting the meat, where a successful hunter's kill is publicly mocked rather than praised, a social mechanism designed to prevent pride from curdling into hierarchy. Standing out too much was dangerous for group cohesion, so success was quietly downplayed. Compare that to a modern feed full of new purchases, promotions, and vacations, each one a small public broadcast of status. The impulse behind both is the same ancient wiring, the need to be seen as valuable within your group. Only the rules around expressing it have completely reversed, from concealing success to constantly displaying it. None of this means you should quit your job tomorrow and disappear into the desert. That fantasy misses the point as badly as the 8-hour grind does. The goal was never to return to the past. It's to recognize which parts of your exhaustion are truly unavoidable, and which parts are simply the residue of a system barely 200 years old pretending to be as permanent as gravity. Knowing this doesn't hand you 15-hour work weeks. The world you live in isn't going to reorganize itself around Kalahari rhythms by tomorrow morning, but it does offer something quieter and maybe more useful: permission. The exhaustion you feel isn't proof that you're falling behind some natural standard of human effort. It's evidence that the standard itself is unnatural, built only a few hundred years ago, layered on top of a nervous system still tuned to a very different rhythm of days. So tonight, when you finally close your laptop, or tomorrow, when a free hour appears and some part of you reaches instinctively for one more task to fill it, pause. Ask what that discomfort actually is. It isn't laziness creeping in. It's an ancient rhythm, one your ancestors lived inside for 200,000 years, quietly asking to be let back in, if only for an afternoon. Your alarm will go off again tomorrow. The inbox will refill itself overnight, the way it always does. But somewhere underneath the calendar and the deadlines, the same brain that once measured a day by sunlight, hunger, and company around a fire is still in there, and it still remembers what enough used to feel like. It has been waiting 200,000 years for you to notice.